Welcome to this presentation on instructional planning in a hybrid model. And recognizing that there's a whole lot we don't know about what to expect this year, the research and suggestions that I'm going to share with you should help prepare for blending the best parts of asynchronous online instruction with the face-to-face teaching practices that we're used to. So even if we are forced back to full-time remote learning, these resources should help you feel more confident moving forward. In this presentation, I'm going to share some of the theory behind blended learning as it had been researched and implemented pre-COVID-19. I recognize there's nothing ideal about our teaching situation this year, but before the pandemic, educators all over the world began reframing their thinking about the school experience, and we can use their work to inform our practices as well. Many of us are feeling overwhelmed just trying to wrap our minds around what planning will look like when we only see students once every other day. I'll share some strategies, templates, and examples to try to help illustrate what this could look like. Organizing planning will be a big obstacle, but one of the first steps is to decide which parts of our teaching we can most efficiently flip for learning at home. When you determine the flow of instruction that works best for your content area and teaching style, unit mapping and lesson planning will become much easier. And lastly, I'll share best practices for determining which parts of your course to keep during our precious face-to-face time with students. So I think it goes without saying that just like in any other educational setting, we have to start with student needs in mind. And you're going to want to begin the school year by helping kids adjust to and prepare for a whole new way of learning. That may even involve unlearning some previous habits. It's just going to look different than it has in prior years. And obviously, building meaningful relationships will be unique as well. The other learning coaches and I will be sharing strategies and resources for this social emotional aspect really soon. But let's start by identifying the shift in mindset that we're going to have to take as we plan for this year. The part that tends to be most overwhelming is that students are going to be doing different things at different times, and that is okay. It's not the way we're used to planning and teaching, but as long as they get to the same place eventually, the logistical part of it doesn't need to be the same. So with that in mind, don't try to keep kids in different scenarios doing the exact same things on the exact same days. For one thing, you're going to be saving yourself a ton of work because you won't be planning for the same topic in two different modalities. But additionally, you'll be providing a lot more flexibility for families. When we design intentionally for remote learning and choose the activities that we put remotely, it really allows parents more flexibility in supporting their kids as they work through instruction. It also allows kids to personalize their timing a little bit better. Some are going to get through assignments much faster than others, and some are going to just need more time. The other positive benefit is just the accessibility that we offer when we put instruction online. So in a normal classroom setting, our students aren't able to go back and hear the way that we explained something. They can't listen to how we demonstrated a process or how we used a formula. But when we put that digitally, when they are practicing, they can look back, they can pause a video to give themselves more processing time. They can rewind when they have zoned out and need to look at something again. Not to mention how our families can look at the way that we've explained and instructed a process and then reinforce that with their students or offer help when it's needed. Another shift in mindset is going to be how your role will be different in a hybrid model. I get it. This involves a loss of control, and that is so difficult. We're used to being able to orchestrate everything that happens in our classrooms, from the timing on certain activities to redirecting or right away catching misunderstandings and even helping our kids who have some issues self-starting. And we all feel that kids learn better from us in person than they can at home or from a video or some other source. But what we need to realize is we can still have autonomy in designing lessons while at the same time we leverage that face-to-face time to be the most effective. So we're going to do this in a really different way this year. Rather than being the full-time instructor, I would consider us to be designers or architects of learning experiences that happen intentionally both in front of us and away from us. That can also and should also still include maintaining a really strong teacher presence on remote learning days. So how can you make it so that students still see your face, hear your voice, know that you're involved, and that you're there with them on their days when they're at home? Part of that might involve you responding to discussion posts or something later that night. It doesn't have to be synchronous, but just how can they feel you instead of feeling so isolated? We're also going to be charged to develop a dynamic online community. So how can we give kids the ability to be able to socialize and interact when we're not there to facilitate? Obviously, we're partnering with families in the learning process, and so communicating with them, especially if there are ways that they can help from home, I'm sure will be really valuable. And then honestly, our role as a curator of resources for them and the guide that gets them there when they're at the point where they need additional information, whether it's to go a little bit deeper with their learning or to know how and where to look if the explanation that we provided wasn't enough. What do they do if they're stuck? All those sorts of things are additional facets to our role as the teacher. The third shift in mindset really is going to be the need to focus on power standards. So we have to consider compacting our curriculum and emphasizing what matters the most. It is just not going to work to do everything we've always done. We can't cover all of the content and convert every activity. That doesn't mean that learning is going to be less. It just means that it's going to be different. So by prioritizing, let's focus on the skills that are most important and be flexible with our curriculum or fluid with our curriculum. Think about how we might be able to match content to location. So are there things that we need to keep in but that learners could access pretty effectively remotely? And then really key to this idea is thinking that a lesson does not necessarily equal one day. This is hard to visualize sometimes, and I'm often asked, I just need to see an example. Can I see an example? So here's what I mean. When we talk about a lesson wrapping across a few days, we think about what parts of what we teach lend themselves best to remote learning and what parts we really need to try hard to keep in person with us or face-to-face with us. So if you look here at this flow of a week, focus on where lesson 4 falls. So Tuesday, after students have done a lesson 3, some sort of formative assessment, then they have access to maybe a 10-minute video launch for lesson 4 topic. This could be building that foundational knowledge. It is instruction where the teacher has created something where their voice is modeling and maybe even for possibly part of it, their face is on screen so students can see that. But then that topic wraps into Wednesday. So beginning class on Wednesday, live face-to-face, the teacher can model and reinforce what was taught or the foundational knowledge that was built on Tuesday, and then be there for that guided practice so that kids aren't practicing something with a misunderstanding or struggling through something because they need help or interrupting you or coming to class without work completed because they couldn't finish it without your input. Then we wrap that idea back into Thursday's beginning activity for the remote day. Maybe they start with a choice to demonstrate their understanding. So this doesn't necessarily have to fit neatly into a calendar to still be really meaningful and have impact. So one of the best pieces of advice that I've seen recently is to really start with some curriculum mapping. Think about a couple of key questions. Where will your instruction happen? Think about what makes the best sense for your content area. Most likely, I would say that we're all going to have some sort of a combination of both face-to-face instruction and remote instruction, especially in the younger grades as we're starting out. I might even start the beginning of the year teaching in person with video recorded lessons so that I could model some metacognition for kids, like do a think aloud about a place where they might be stuck or have a misunderstanding or want to pause, or model filling in some guided notes. But then try to progress toward really prioritizing what parts students need you the most in person. And I think that those are the pieces that are more complex. As we move through depth of knowledge, kids need our support and our immediate feedback in the more complex tasks. So what parts of lessons will everybody be doing the same thing? Identifying those and flipping them to be video-based lessons that can be accessible at home or repeatedly will really equip kids to be successful. Then ask yourself, what do we really value as evidence of remote learning? So at the end of the unit, how will we know that students have really mastered this skill? I found a great resource this summer called the Distance Learning Playbook, and it's published or is written by Douglas Fisher and Nancy Frey and John Hattie. And one of the concerns that John Hattie specifically shared was us having the tendency to misplace our focus on doing as much direct instruction as possible in live sessions. And so being brave to let go of a little bit of that and really making sure that we're there for students for when they need us for that application piece is going to be pivotal. So I'd suggest thinking in mini units. Our hybrid schedule right now seems to work in a 2-week cycle because that's the point at which your cohorts will align. So I would identify those target standards, think small, so do like small steps, 1 or 2 standards for a mini unit, and then come up with some really clear student-friendly learning objectives, making sure that we really clearly share those with kids. After you know where you're going, reconsider what success criteria looks like. So are we preparing for an exam, a test? Are we going to try to do something, particularly if we're concerned about validity when kids aren't in front of us? How might we come up with something where they perform or demonstrate a skill rather than only focusing on answering questions? So once you know where you're going and you have those criteria established, then you just consider what are students going to need to progress toward those objectives. Where do they need modeling? Where might they be able to look at a print resource? Where are they really going to just need some different explanations of things? Where do we need to pull all those resources from? And then you can brainstorm your activities and instructional strategies and decide within those which to keep with you and which to put remotely. At that point, you choose your digital tools. So do not feel like you need to start with the technology at the forefront. This isn't about showstopper projects. This is about leveraging the technology to be as effective as we can in this setting. So if there's a particular instructional strategy that you want to use, then how can we find tools that will help to make that happen? And I've got lots of suggestions for that as well. So here is just a piece of advice from Catlin Tucker, who's one of the leading researchers in blended learning, and she has published several books on the topic. In her advice about choosing what to plan for synchronous or face-to-face instruction versus that remote time. So she says when working in a blended course, it becomes really important to think about how to provide instruction. If we have really limited time in the classroom, we don't want to spend that time talking at them. Instead, focus on high-value activities rather than the explanations that everyone needs to hear. these could work really well as a recorded video. Another piece of advice from her is that you look at your unit, or once you have prioritized and maybe eliminated parts that you can let go of, then take a linear agenda and write it out horizontally. So when you would do things in a chronological order, write those things out horizontally to reimagine how you can designate where, when, and how those different things happen. Here are a bunch of suggestions of ideas for learning at home days. I know that what we're going to be inclined to do will be interactive video lessons, maybe even like student-paced things through Nearpod, or giving assignments based on what we've done the day before. But there are so many different opportunities that we can harness here, and really keeping students engaged would really be helpful to use a combination of these different things and mix it up quite often. So how might we find an online simulation or a virtual field trip? Could we use a podcast as a text rather than something in print? Or what other multimedia text sets could we find? Not all of our learning at home activities have to be digital. You can definitely find a ton of ideas for analog activities that students can do to demonstrate understanding, and then maybe they just snap a picture of that, record an explanation with their voice over top of it, and submit that as their evidence for the day. I know we've got lots of different tools to do some app-based practice, but could we come up with a way for students to collaborate virtually, socialize, and interact on Google Slides or on some sort of a project, or to give each other feedback? There are so many different ways that we could rethink that learning time other than making it more like a whole day of homework. So let's talk about some flipped learning strategies. If we're going to plan to use video-based instruction, then let's think about the flow of that. So before students watch the video, what kinds of activities might you plan for them to pique their interest? They can make predictions. I mean, all of the same things that we have done face-to-face. Let's just find some ways to give them that opportunity at home. And hopefully that might even include some sort of interaction with their peers. During the actual lesson, if you're using video, obviously, then what can you combine it with to really engage students? So one of the things I like to see videos split into short segments with like something that students have to do in between, whether it's just answering a question or maybe like a matching activity, whatever it could be. But along with that, can we provide guided notes, particularly for our younger learners that we often assume know how to take good notes and may not. And then along with the video, could we include some simulations or some areas where they have to go and explore as they learn more of the content that we're teaching? Could we combine the video with some creation tools where they have to make something to show what they're learning? And one of my favorite examples of this is taking kind of the structure of a worksheet that you might have that goes along with a lesson that you've taught, but making it interactive. And what I mean by that is, like, can we use a template to create something where students have to not just answer questions, but additionally like do something or add something to the template? So think more like interactive type workbooks. Is there a way that we can include them taking a photo or using a markup tool or something like that as part of the actual learning process? And then once they've finished the video, our inclination is going to be that we want them to practice. But try to go maybe a little bit deeper than just doing practice problems. Can we pair them up in some way? Can we find game-based practice? We know they love that. Maybe using some sort of a collaborative way for them to be able to discuss with each other or collaborate in some slides, allow them to be creative and sketch note. Maybe you have a choice board that could be, a pretty simple like practice activity, but something that they could choose the modality of. And then something that I think is probably the most important part of all of this, maybe it won't be every single remote day, but shoot for maybe once a week to have students reflect on the process. What's working well? What are they struggling with? How are they feeling about all of this? I think one of the best skills that we can equip students with is the ability to communicate specifically where their misunderstandings are. So we are all going to have the students that come to us and say, I didn't understand any of it. I just didn't get it. But if we can help them to figure out what exactly was the struggle, it'll be a lot easier to be able to help them. So if you've done any sort of research on your own, looking for lesson plan templates or unit plan templates, a lot of what is out there is based on something called the Community of Inquiry Framework. And this was developed around the unique nature of teaching and learning online. So a lot of blended learning resources are based on this. I love the idea of inquiry-driven learning. I also think that as our students are really new to this process, we have to build up to that. So maybe just trying to think more at models of flipped instruction to start, and then using some of those guiding principles of the framework might be more beneficial for you. If you're familiar with hyperdocs, those often are based also on that Community of Inquiry framework. So for your remote learning days, think about maybe starting off with your asynchronous lessons supporting prior learning or ongoing projects, but beware of the homework effect. Like, build up to not just having students work independently to complete assignments when they're at home. And then again, I know I've mentioned it, but just creating space for social interaction. It's a great opportunity for us to teach them about respectful communication, especially when we're not there to monitor it all of the time. We can talk about their digital footprint and how everything really is accessible and searchable, discoverable at all times. Thinking through your remote lessons when we want students to be able to learn from video, here are just a couple of pointers about what that flow could look like as well. So communicating clearly with students, like, what is the learning target? Give them an overview of what they're going to be doing. Research suggests 10 minutes maximum for your direct instruction. If you absolutely need to do more than that, consider creating 2 separate videos. So like something that they would access first when they get online, and then break it up with some sort of an activity or interaction or practice or whatever, and then maybe have them watch an additional piece of footage so that it's not, 15, 20, 30 minutes long. Try to use multimodal assignment instructions, so print instructions as well as audio, or just a quick recording of your voice or video where you explain or read that to them can be helpful for a lot of kids. As I mentioned, curating resources for them to extend or find help, building in some interaction, and then thinking about those short but really targeted demonstrations of understanding. It's really strategic integration of the technology that allows kids and teachers to construct their learning together. So I love some of the ideas that I'm seeing all over Twitter right now about giving students options of demonstrating what they got, even though they may not be able to score 100% on a formative assessment like a quiz after just the digital instruction. They are going to have learned something by the time that they come to you. So there's some great ways that you can use some content neutral technology for them to showcase that. When you're ready to start planning your lessons and mapping them out across the different days or weeks, here are a few examples, strategies that you could use as far as what that format could be. The biggest thing though is don't create more work for yourself by planning every single day for both remote and face-to-face. You're going to end up with twice as much work if you do that. Instead, just take what you plan for the remote day for cohort A and move it to the next remote day for cohort B. So cohort B might always be, of course, after the very first day of school. Cohort B always be one day behind cohort A. We can talk more about that first day and ideas for that later. So a flow like this might be something like a welcome to the week video with some sort of launch activity to pique interest, tap into background knowledge, typical things, but we're doing this remotely. Flipped lesson, a little bit of practice, and a very informal formative assessment just to gauge how much students were able to learn without you. Then when they're with you on Tuesday, you're able to review, remediate, reinforce, do that really important guided practice, and take things a little bit deeper with some application. So in this example, your layout pretty much is remote lesson and then extension with the teacher, and then a remote lesson and then extension with the teacher. Another idea, especially for those that are wanting to sort of scaffold to that flipped plan, might be starting with something like an assigned reading, maybe followed by an online discussion based on that. Maybe you give them questions that they respond to and encourage them to ask one question each themselves and respond to each other. Again, some sort of way to gauge, maybe the discussion is the formative assessment, but some way to gauge what they understood and retained from that reading, and then pull that lesson into your face-to-face time with your guided practice. A lot of our subject areas are going to lend themselves really nicely to projects, which you were probably going to want to launch together with students. But once they know what they're working toward and what they're going to do, some of that application can be remote. They can continue to practice what you have worked on with them when they're at home. And so this might be a better plan for the first couple of weeks until we feel confident that they're able to work through flipped lessons on their own. But the key to this really is that they are using that project time as the practice for what you taught them, and then you're able to give them feedback on that during the face-to-face time. So the same way that if students were writing an essay, we wouldn't want them to be writing individually all day on the face-to-face class day and then doing peer evaluations on the remote day. We'd rather them do the work remotely so that we can give them that feedback and make it more constructive with our guidance. So that's my advice for that sort of an example. Here's another one. If you are ready to explore more of an inquiry-based approach, this might work for you. So you launch with an activity on a remote day. When you're with students, unpack those objectives so that they really clearly understand what they're going to be learning and what the expectations will be for what they're going to be doing. You can help to guide the exploration process, answering questions along the way, doing maybe even conferencing about the criteria that they're trying to meet for the project so that they have either small group or individual feedback and a direction to go the next time they're working independently. So something like that might work well with this. You can do things like class discussions as a great way to unpack complex texts. Do that sort of thing face-to-face and offer feedback. You can see in this example also on Wednesday, there is a lesson. And then on Thursday, face-to-face, there's a lesson. So we don't need to only actually instruct every other day either. We just have to be intentional about choosing which pieces to put where.
And then here's one last example. And again, this isn't all of it. You figure out what works best. But in this case, maybe we have students working through a HyperDoc for content acquisition. And those lead students into lots of different activities and different things that they're looking at and accessing and completing along the way. And then when they're with us, we're able to provide some guidance to look at the progress that they've made, to facilitate discussions, or really spend some time individually with them, gauging, what they need from us and responding like that. And they can continue with the HyperDoc on Wednesday and sort of the same sort of feedback that we offer during that face-to-face time on Thursday. So hopefully those will help you wrap your minds around some of the possibilities, or maybe even coming up with your own unique variation that works better for you. A lot of what I've shared is based on the work of Weston Kieschnick, who wrote the book Bold School, and it aligns with his framework for strategic blended learning. But what I really appreciate about his work is he argues that we don't need to start from scratch. We can continue to use the same sound instructional strategies that we use in a traditional classroom and enhance them with technology to make them accessible and even more engaging for students. So his book is about being goal-oriented and strategic, deliberate and purposeful, putting the pedagogy at the forefront of our planning, which obviously we always want to do. He uses John Hattie's meta-analyses to outline some of the highest impact strategies and ways that we can enhance them with technology. So starting with something like questioning, what makes this technique even more impactful when we put it digitally is that we can reach every single student. When every student has to answer a question online versus only the one that raises their hand in our class to participate, no one can hide. Our introverts will come out. We'll be able to really know better what our students know and are able to do than we might if we had, limited access or limited time for only certain students to be able to answer. Using tools like Nearpod, Flipgrid, Apple Clips, facilitating even those sort of Socratic discussions or literature circle discussions, some of which might even be able to happen through discussion threads in Schoology could be great use. Another idea would be to think about how we might be able to use explicit contextualized vocabulary instruction. So something as simple as using like a Freyer model template, but having students do a Google image search to represent the idea, even if it is something abstract. Because we know that those repeated exposures and the context is really going to help to enhance comprehension. All of these strategies are going to have a positive impact on learning if they're done well. The thing on the list, though, that comes up with the smallest effect size, so has the smallest impact, actually is the one that I think we default to probably most often, worked examples and think-alongs. But if we pair the metacognition and the demonstration, the modeling that we are showing students with the other things on this list and build a repertoire of strategies, we are going to have a really robust blended learning program to offer in our hybrid model. Here's some additional ideas for you to consider if the alternating Mondays or those weird Mondays are kind of getting in your way for planning. Maybe it won't be within every 2-week unit, but now and then you're just not quite sure how to utilize the remote time that you'll have with students, or in that case, maybe even the face-to-face time. Consider what kinds of standalone activities will still bring value, still help students as you spiral through curriculum, reinforce and practice, so that you're not having to stop instruction, but maybe there are things that aren't as time dependent as others. So your ongoing practice, especially the apt-based things, could be something that you have them do remotely. There are always great ideas for standalone performance tasks that can be found in your PLNs or all throughout Twitter. Writing projects or any sort of like not time specific but still related reading activities could be great examples of what to do on these kinds of days as well. And then when you have students face to face, maybe those extra times are ways for you to really tie in some social emotional learning check-ins with kids while you're still continuing to provide the support that they need academically. I love John Carippo's Edu protocols, and so there are some that really lend themselves very well to reinforcement. So if you have the opportunity to look up how to share the activity, like the favorite wrong answer, where maybe a teacher will share an example of something of work that students did and there was a mistake, and together you kind of unpack that and make those corrections. It works for revision writing as well in the paragraph protocol. So those are great things to look into. This would be a nice opportunity for cross-curricular projects or tie-ins. Maybe there's an opportunity to take a day and do a team-wide activity that builds on math, literacy, and STEM skills all together. One of the greatest byproducts of our hybrid model will definitely be our smaller class sizes. So wrap your minds around how we might make the most of those smaller groups of students. Maybe that means we can provide a little bit more leveled instruction or differentiation. Maybe it allows us the time and the capacity to build some conceptual understanding for our struggling learners, or to accelerate or really push the students that are doing really well to extend their learning. In smaller groups, hands-on learning activities might still be possible. So those, times when the groups are cut in half, maybe in smaller groups, hands-on learning activities will still be possible. But you'll always have the opportunity in a smaller group size to get to know students more and to foster those relationships. You may find yourself giving students more one-on-one attention in a hybrid model than you would in our traditional school year. Some final thoughts as you set out to start planning for the year. Ask yourself, how relevant and impactful is each student assignment? Especially those that we assign for students to complete at home, we need to make sure that we're getting the maximum impact. Second, how much information are you presenting at one time? Obviously, we have to consider the complexity of the standard with this. And third, what kind of consistent and predictable flow can you create to maximize engagement? Best wishes at the start of the school year. And please reach out if you have any questions or want any additional information.